Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. So last night, President Trump decided to launch air strikes against Syria. He claims that this is in retaliation for the Assad regime using chemical weapons against their own people. He claims that he was moved by images of children suffering from chemical attacks in Syria. You had civilians that allegedly suffer from chemical attacks there. Um, According to the New York Times, like 500 people in Syria were treated for chemical attacks, and some people were killed. And for that reason, Donald Trump claims that he decided to launch these attacks. Again, he accuses the Assad regime of being responsible for this. He hit 3 targets, according to the reports that I have read. Also, according to the reports, Russia claims that they have intercepted like 71 of the missiles that were launched out of 103 missiles that were launched. That's what's being claimed. And also, this article from the New York Times points out how the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons is conducting an investigation to find out exactly what happened, like what kind of chemical weapons were used, who was responsible, and all that kind of stuff, from what I understand. So there's still an investigation going on, despite these claims that the Trump administration has put out there about how Syria is definitely responsible for this attack and this and that. So I'm going to get into that in a second. But as I listened to Trump address the nation, all I thought about was the power of propaganda, because this man's speech was filled with patriotism and it was filled with religion and appeals to God. He was talking about praying for the soldiers, praying for their families and this and that. And he was talking about patriotism. He was talking about bravery and all this and that. And really, that kind of language, that kind of propaganda is designed to appeal to one's emotions and not their reason. So they no longer think about things critically. They no longer ask the critical questions. Instead, they get wrapped up in the emotionalism of patriotism. They get wrapped up in the emotionalism of religion. And they stop thinking critically. And that's essentially the purpose of propaganda. And that's what his speech was. It was pure propaganda. Because at this point, we don't know with certainty whether or not Assad was responsible for those chemical attacks. We don't know. I mean, there's still an investigation going on. There's suspicion, but we don't know. In fact, I think more likely than not, it's a staged situation where one of Assad's enemies probably did this in order to get the United States to intervene and take out the Assad regime. I think that that is a likely or possible scenario, something that cannot be discounted, because at this point you still have this organization, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, still conducting an investigation. But yet the United States wants to rush to judgment and conclude automatically that Syria is responsible. So that's one thing. And then we know about the history of the United States when it comes to war, when it comes to intervention in these countries. We know that there has been a track record of false allegations leveled against different countries in order to justify imperialism. And that's what this is, nothing but imperialism. We saw this in the Iraq War when they said there was weapons of mass destruction there. And after invading that country, after taking all those lives, after causing all that death and mayhem there, it was found out that Saddam had no weapons of mass destruction. And we saw this with the, Vietnam War, based on lies and false pretenses and all that kind of stuff. So this is likely a continuation of that type of situation. So that's one thing. And then, I think that this is a situation, just as the Syrians pointed out, to save face. Because here you have Donald Trump, constantly criticizing Obama for allowing Syria to cross some land in the, some line in the sand or whatever. So he had to save face. In order to save face, he decided to launch these attacks. And the problem with this whole thing is that it's going to widen the conflict. I mean, Syria is a place where you have all these interests, all these foreign powers involved, waging a proxy war. You have all these different interests. You have Russia there. You have Iran there. You have the United States. You have Saudi Arabia. So you have all these different interests. You have Turkey with certain interests there as well. So you have all these different interests. And right now, the Russians and the Iranians are propping up the Assad regime. And the United States conflict with Assad, it's only going to intensify the conflict between the United States and Russia. I was reading some article where they were talking about how Russia was already advising its citizens to prepare for nuclear war. This is a very disturbing article, and I'll post a link to that article in the description box. It's an article from Newsweek. You have to check that out. It's very troubling. And then, you have the Russians claiming that they intercepted, some of those missiles. It is very possible that this situation in Syria can escalate into a larger conflict involving the United States against Russia. And that's a horrible scenario. It would be horrible for the United States to get into such a large conflict with a major power over some country in the Middle East in their civil war. That would be a disaster. And it's not worth it at the end of the day. So you had a situation where Trump is trying to save face because he wants to prove that he's going to do something about these chemical weapons and blah, blah, blah. He's saving face at the expense of American lives. Because you can't bomb all these countries abroad and not expect any kind of retaliation. For years, the United States thought that they could do whatever they wanted around the world. They thought that until we had 9/11 in this country. So we got to be conscious of what happens. We have to hold these leaders accountable. And these kinds of decisions about war is really something that should be up to Congress. Before this man, commits any more acts of war against Syria, he needs to get approval from Congress. And this is something that Bernie Sanders and plenty of others have pointed out. And it's something that's very important. And, there's a couple of other things that we need to talk about. And one thing is this, Trump criticized Obama for making announcements about military plans ahead of time. And here we are a week after this chemical attack. And you had Donald Trump making all these statements about his plans to attack Syria. So these people were on notice. They knew it was coming. So they were able to plan accordingly, I'm sure. Like if they're intelligent, in this wartime situation, then surely if they are the ones responsible for these chemical attacks and they do in fact have these chemical weapons, surely they move those weapons elsewhere to secure them. So those three attacks, those three targets that the Trump administration hit probably did not incapacitate Syria. It probably did not take out all their chemical arsenal or their chemical capability. So if they in fact have these weapons. So that's one thing. After criticizing Obama for making announcements about military plans, here you had this buffoon, making his military plans well known, well ahead of time, tweeting on Twitter about this ahead of time, which is asinine and stupid. The fact of the matter is we got a juvenile in the White House, a 70-something-year-old man that acts like a teenager on Twitter, talking about war and this and that on Twitter, jeopardizing lives on Twitter. And the thing that's so sad, man, why this guy talks about bravery of these warriors, American soldiers and stuff like this is a coward, a man that did everything in his power to avoid serving in the Vietnam War, but he has no problem sending your children, your loved ones, into harm's way in order to satisfy his ego. So this is a very frightening situation. And another point that has to be raised is this. He's saying that he's acting to help the civilians and stuff like that. He's helping these civilians that were gassed by dropping bombs on them. More likely than not, these attacks that they waged last night probably killed some innocent civilians. They claim that they're all surgical and this and that. But the fact of the matter is, more likely than not, innocents were caught into that crossfire. And you can't help people by bombing people. What we need in Syria is a diplomatic solution. And that brings me to my point about this being an act of imperialism. I have to explain that. I have no problem with a nation using force to defend itself and to protect its real interests. Obviously, I have no problem with that, with the United States, for instance, defending itself from a threat. But here you have a situation all the way in the Middle East where you have these people fighting with each other, a nation that's at war with itself, a nation in civil war and all that kind of stuff, launching attacks against each other, killing each other. And, you have this chemical attack. But that chemical attack was not against the United States. It wasn't against the United States. The Syrian government has not launched any kind of attack against the United States. So there's no justification for attacking the Syrian government because they haven't attacked the United States. The United States should mind its own business and stay out of that conflict. That's what the United States should do. Because these people, they don't pose any kind of real threat to us. The Assad regime, they don't pose any threat to us. The people that pose a threat to us are empowered by the destabilization of the Assad regime. You have terrorist groups like ISIS that will be emboldened and empowered with the destruction of the Assad regime. We saw this in Libya. They talked about how they needed to get rid of a quote-unquote dictator, Gaddafi. That's what they talked about. They took him out. And what do you have in Libya now? You have chaos. What do you have in Libya now? You have extremism. It is now like a haven for terrorists because there's no stability. And also that country has become a haven for the enslavement of African people as well. That's what was brought in the name of fighting against tyranny and fighting for democracy and all that kind of stuff. Now they have chaos over there. And I'm sure that you'll have the same type of situation over there in Syria. Even though they've taken out and, eliminated a lot of ISIS's territory, if they really take out Assad, all they're doing is inviting these more extremist elements into a position of power. They're creating a vacuum that will be filled by extremists. That's what they're doing. So, that's what I have to say about this whole thing, man. I just don't think that any good is going to come out of this. And I really think that this is the beginning. There's probably going to be need for more airstrikes and all that kind of stuff. And the funny thing about it is Donald Trump the other day was talking about how we need to pull out troops from Syria and all that kind of stuff. The United States needs to leave. And you had these generals and stuff saying, well, no, they were like contesting what he was saying and other people were contesting what he said. And, I just think the timing of this whole situation is curious, to say the least. But anyway, tell me what y'all think. Tell me what you think about Donald Trump's decision to launch airstrikes against Syria. Do you support it? Are you against it? Also, I'll say this, man. This is a convenient way to stop the press from talking about Stormy Daniels, to stop the press from talking about Michael Cohen, to stop the press from talking about the Mueller investigation, to stop all these controversies that are surrounding this man. It's convenient. As I said in my prior videos, nothing but like that Wag the Dog film where they're trying to distract people away from these very important issues involving Donald Trump and his corruption. I mean, the funny thing about it, as I pointed out, like somebody posted this meme on my Facebook about how this man called Hillary crooked Hillary, but here he is crooked as hell being investigated, and all these people in his administration are have been indicted and are under investigation. And what better way to take attention away from all that than to drop a few bombs on Syria? So anyway, tell me what y'all think. Please rate, comment, and subscribe. Peace.